Welcome to Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning for Wednesday, April 5th. I'm your host, Tom Moore. The Indiana game is in 151 days. The game against Michigan in 235 days. On yesterday's show, you heard Mark Givler and I talking about Ohio State's recruiting class, and one of the things we brought up was Brian Hartline. You just kind of never worry about Brian Hartline because he's going to bring in top-level talent, and then generally one of those guys, or maybe more, are going to really sort of show out that first spring. It seems to happen more often than not, and it is happening again this year. Carnell Tate has already lost his black stripe, already starting to make a little bit of a name for himself with Julian Fleming and Emeka Egbuka out. A few more reps available this spring, and Carnell Tate is taking the advantage of that and making some waves in that Ohio State wide receiver room, maybe a little earlier than a lot of people would have thought. So we're going to tell you a little bit about what Carnell Tate has done this spring, and then we always try to be responsible here with setting expectations. We're going to go through what is a realistic best case scenario for Carnell Tate this fall. It is not 1,800 yards and 27 touchdowns. Just go ahead and write that down. It is not going to have 27 touchdowns receiving this year. So what is he going to do? Well, Tony Gerdeman is here to help me figure that out. Tony, I guess let's start with what we've seen so far, because obviously we've been impressed when we've gotten a chance to see him in person. Brian Hartline and the coaching staff has been impressed because they took his black stripe off already. So what is it that we've actually seen from Carnell Tate so far this spring?
Yeah, and what is interesting is, I've seen one practice, one scrimmage, you've seen another. We have not been able to see the same scrimmages, which maybe gives us even more perspective since we've seen him do it in a couple of separate practices. But what I see is a guy who makes catches on the sidelines, a guy who is running sharp routes. There's no, you don't see any question in what he's doing. He's confident, he's secure, he's big, he's fast, and really when you watch him, he looks like he's a veteran. He does not look like he's a freshman. You don't see him getting yelled at like other freshmen do. They're not doing something correct. I don't know that I've seen him. I think I've seen him drop one pass, but it's a situation where, as we've talked about for years on Buckeye Weekly in the past, where Jackson Smith-Njigba, Garrett Wilson, they stand out the first time you see them in the spring, and I think Carnell Tate did that for me. What about for you?
Yeah, he does feel like, there are three of the freshman wide receivers in this spring, Tate, plus Noah Rogers, plus Bryson Rogers. All three of those guys have made plays at times. It feels like there is some there with all three of those guys. They are probably all going to end up being, fairly significant contributors to Ohio State at some point. Tate just feels like maybe he's a little bit ahead of the other guys at the moment. And before we dive into sort of realistic expectations for the fall, I guess let's start with letting people know sort of where he's working right now, because Ohio State obviously has three wide receiver positions. They have the X, which is kind of the big, tall possession receiver kind of guy. They've got the H, which is the slot receiver, who is generally the, typically the short, shifty guy. That was Jackson Smith-Njigba was there a lot last year. And then you got the Z, and that is the fast guy who runs downfield. That was the Jamison Williams position. That was the Devin Smith position. That is something that people might be looking at Jaden Ballard and kind of saying might be the Jaden Ballard position at some point. So which of those spots is Carnell Tate working at right now, and who would he potentially have to share reps with this fall at that spot?
Well, yeah, and that's the tricky part, because when I've seen him, he's been at X, and he's one of a bunch of receivers at X, but also Ohio State's starting X receiver is Marvin Harrison. You may have heard of him. But what we've also seen this spring is Marvin Harrison is moving all over the place. They're running him in the slot. They're running him everywhere. They want to get him involved. They want him to get used to moving around, and they did some of that with him in the past, so it's nothing new. But it tells me that they've got guys that they want to work in. Carnell Tate already working with the twos, already making plays. You've got Marvin Harrison ahead of him. This is a versatile group of receivers who cross-train at all positions, so they're not going to keep Carnell Tate on the bench because of Marvin Harrison's inability to play any other position. They'll move guys around if they need to in order to get who they want. So it's going to be difficult for any true freshman to get a bunch of snaps at receiver this year, because it's not just Marvin Harrison. You've got Emeka Egbuka, you've got Julian Fleming, You've got Xavier Johnson, all of these guys who are experienced, probably playing their last season at Ohio State. Very reliable, very productive. So it's more than just Marvin Harrison, but if you're talking about a depth chart, who is the guy in front of Carnell Tate right now, it's Marvin Harrison. But I would expect to see those two guys on the field more than just a handful of times this year together.
Oh, absolutely. And it does feel like, there are a couple things that are working in Tate's favor there. Number one is they are going to want to get best three on the field. And if Carnell Tate ends up as one of the best three, well, he's going to be on the field and they will figure it out. And even if he's not one of the best three, you're going to end up you want to move guys around a little bit. Jackson Smith-Njigba did not exclusively play in the slot because Jackson Smith-Njigba and Emeka Ibuka were both slot guys last year. And they were already, we saw them working different guys at different spots because they knew that those two were probably two of their best three receivers entering last season. So sometimes you're going to move outside. The other thing is sometimes they move Marvin Harrison to the slot just to change the matchup and make the other team have to account for him. Because if he's consistently in the same spot, well, that makes him a little easier to defend because hey, he's going to be on this side of the formation and he's going to, you can just shade a safety over there. Well, if you're moving him around, that makes you a little less predictable and a little more difficult to defend. So we're probably, I think you're not going to just see Carnell Tate in garbage time this year because you're playing Marvin Harrison all the meaningful snaps. You're going to see him a bunch of other times as well, and Marvin Harrison probably moving around a little bit and freeing some snaps up for Carnell Tate. So now I thought the most interesting part of this conversation though was what is a realistic expectation for Carnell Tate as a true freshman wide receiver at Ohio State? Because I think you throw that out there, and I think people are going to say, at least, 500 yards and 5 touchdowns, 6 touchdowns, something like that. You went back 40 years, 40 years to go through all the true freshman wide receivers at Ohio State, going back to when Chris Carter was a true freshman. And, you know the answer to this already, so I'm going to put this out to the listeners. How many true freshmen do you think have had 500 yards receiving in their true freshman season? You can mentally play the Jeopardy music in your head right now as you think about it. And are you ready? The answer is one person, and that was Chris Carter in 1984. How many true freshman wide receivers do you think have had 400 yards receiving in one season, in their true freshman season? The answer is 3. It is Chris Carter and David Boston and Garrett Wilson. Ted Ginn, you think of Ted Ginn in 2004, and oh boy, wasn't Ted Ginn a weapon for Ohio State? 25 catches, 359 yards, 2 touchdowns. 4 guys with 300 yards or more, 5 guys with 200 yards or more. Devin Smith in 2011, 14 catches, 294 yards. Everyone else below 200 yards receiving. So, I guess, Tony, I would sort of expect Carnell Tate to potentially be at least at the 200, 250 yards and maybe more. Maybe he's in the 400 yard range. But I mean, what is a realistic line for Carnell Tate for the 2023 season in terms of his true freshman year at Ohio State? What's a reasonable but not overly conservative projection for him?
Yeah, and this is with the understanding that Ted Ginn Jr. was criminally underutilized as a true freshman at Ohio State, but he also carried the ball here a couple times and was a returner. I'm thinking when you look, there's 6 guys that have averaged a catch per game as a true freshman. And I think Carnell Tate can get into that. So that puts him somewhere between, Devin Smith and Ted Ginn for me, because, having somebody catch more than 25 passes, you're talking, 2 a game basically for a true freshman where when it has only happened once in the last, almost 20 years now, and that being Garrett Wilson to have a guy over, 20 receptions. I think Carnell Tate gets there. I don't see him going. I think I keep him below Ted Ginn at 25, somewhere in there, 20 to 24, 17 to 24, somewhere in there, because there's just a lot of guys. And there's also a lot of running backs that you think they might want to run the ball this year. So I don't know that they'll be throwing it as much as they have in the past. So I'm going to say somewhere between like 18 and 24 catches, which would equate to, can he get over 300 yards receiving? I think right in there, 280, 320, something like that. Is that conservative? Is that not conservative?
It feels like that's something you would say, wow, he's playing it really safe. Is this a bold prediction show? And the answer is no, he is not. But it is, that feels like it's super conservative. And you look at the track record over the years, and it's like, no, that's probably about right. And, I think you do the same thing when you're looking at, like, what's the third running back going to have for Ohio State? And it consistently, that person's in the 200 to 250-ish yard range most seasons, because in your head, you're thinking, well, the whole second half against Rutgers, certainly he will run for 120 yards. And it's like, no, generally they get 8 carries and 32 yards or something like that. And it takes a while to get up to the 200, 250 yards that running back ends up with. And, you look at some of the other guys who have had that black stripe removed very early, because that was something that you talked about. We've talked about on either this show or Buckeye Weekly or both since it happened. Tate got his black stripe removed in very, very select company in terms of who else has gotten that black stripe removed so early in their careers. But some of the guys, Austin Mack, for example, he had that black stripe removed super, super early. Everyone went, oh man, get ready for the huge blow up freshman season. And he had 2 catches for 15 yards. And, you get Jackson Smith-Njigba gets a little bit of a pass on this in terms of his freshman season being the 2020 season where you didn't have the non-conference games. But he finished with 10 catches for 49 yards and a touchdown. And, really the exception is Garrett Wilson, 30 catches for 432 yards, 5 touchdowns. He was kind of the, historical outlier. He's the only one since David Boston to put up more than 400 yards receiving as a true freshman. Some of the other guys, Chris Olave, you think of Chris Olave and, the huge game against Michigan, and man, he must have been really super impactful as a true freshman. 12 catches, 197 yards, 3 touchdowns. Like, you can think of 2/3 of Chris Olave's touchdowns right now in your head because they came in the first half against Michigan in 2018. And, someone else who I think is maybe even more instructive, we were talking about this before we hit record here, Marvin Harrison Jr., again, a receiver you have heard of at some point in the past, a receiver of some note. As a true freshman, 11 catches, 139 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Yeah, he scored 3 touchdowns in the Rose Bowl. The Rose Bowl also comprised more than half of his receptions, more than half of his yards, and all of his touchdowns, all in that Rose Bowl. And he was only playing in that Rose Bowl because Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson opted out. So, the path to the playing field, yeah, you're going to see these guys on the field, but it's not as easy as you might think to crack that rotation, because you've got the 3 returning starters, but also you've got Jaden Ballard, you've got Xavier Johnson. I mean, this is Brian Hartline talked about having 6 to 7 guys he really kind of felt, maybe kind of comfortable with right now, and you would certainly assume Carnell Tate is one of them. But there are still a lot of other guys that he would have to jump over on that depth chart to, potentially earn a starting job this year.
Well, and being comfortable with having somebody on the field and actually putting them on the field are still 2 different things, because we have not really seen Brian Hartline go that route and rotate in a bunch of guys, because even Marvin Harrison, as a true freshman, his first catch came in week 4. His second catch came in week 7, the 7th game of the season before he caught his second pass. So you look at the progression of Marvin Harrison, and he was good enough to start at the end of the year, same as Emeka Egbuka. Now, as you mentioned, Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson were gone, but those 2 guys, it seemed that they were good enough to play as freshmen, but still, and they were out there at times, but didn't really get targeted. So that's another thing for Carnell Tate. It's one thing to get to play, then it's another thing to get targeted. And if you're out there with Marvin Harrison, pretty good chance that Marvin Harrison's going to be the guy getting targeted. So some of those aren't necessarily wasted snaps, but don't expect the ball when you're out there with Marvin Harrison, especially if they're moving Marvin Harrison into the slot to get him on a safety or a linebacker or something. Just go run your route and clear out space for whoever is actually getting the ball. But I think the Marvin Harrison comparison is interesting, because I think it tells people to, calm down in terms of what you think a talented true freshman should do, because look at Marvin Harrison, 11 for 139. Like even Duron Carter in 2009, 13 for 176. These are, pretty basic numbers for guys who came in very heralded, and it's not something that just happens. And Garrett Wilson is just a different kind of guy, as you've seen in his 3 years in college and his one rookie of the year in the NFL. And he didn't necessarily take over a starting job. He just worked his way into the lineup. David Boston, Chris Carter, they eventually won starting jobs. David Boston, I think he came off the bench for maybe like the first 6 games and then took over for Buster Tillman and eventually won that job. I don't see Carnell Tate winning a starting job, but can he get into a rotation to where he can do what Garrett Wilson did with 30 catches? I think that's asking a lot, but Garrett Wilson was part of he came into a receiver room that was established, but those receivers weren't as talented as the receivers that Carnell Tate is working into. But if they rotate like they did in, say, 2014, 2015, there will be enough opportunities. Brian Hartline has never shown that to be what he wants to do.
Yeah, that is something that has sort of gone away in the last few years, and you always wonder, is that a philosophical thing, or is that a, Jimmy's and Joe's issue where you didn't feel like you had the guys who, in that second string can stack up to the guys in that first string. So if you do, maybe this is the year it happens, and if not, well, Marvin Harrison and Emeka Ibuka and Julian Fleming are all draft eligible after this upcoming season, so it might only take a year, but Carnell Tate will, in fact, eventually, most likely, end up on the field at Ohio State. But this year, feel free to get excited. Please do so responsibly. That's we'll end this like those sports gambling ads. Enjoy Carnell Tate responsibly this fall. So that will do it. We have a busy day at Buckeye Huddle again on Wednesday. Tony and Kevin and I will be at the Woody. Practice number 10 for the Buckeyes. We'll be on the indoor field talking to those guys after the practice. We're talking to running backs. We're talking to tight ends. Talking to Tony Alford. Talking to Keenan Bailey. So our last positional interviews of the spring after practice number 10 of the spring as we count down to next Saturday and the spring game at Ohio Stadium on April 15th. I saw an email or a notification from Ohio State that the early forecast for that day is in the 80s. Sunny and in the 80s. You can decide how much you want to take the 10-day out weather forecast seriously or not, but early indications there are probably not any snow. So could be a fun day at Ohio Stadium. We will be there for that one as well, of course, covering the spring game, covering the rest of spring football for you, all at BuckeyeHuddle.com. Lots of team coverage, lots of recruiting news breaking this week. Talked to Mark a bunch about some of that recruiting news, the commitment that just happened, the commitments that could be coming soon. So you're going to want to be at BuckeyeHuddle.com to follow along with all of that stuff. You can sign up today, get access to all of our team coverage, all of our recruiting coverage, all of our scheme coverage, and of course, our fantastic community as well. It's all at BuckeyeHuddle.com. That will do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.